Today is October 15th in the year 2013. I'm Karen Herman with the Archive of American Television. It is my great pleasure today to be interviewing Bob Anderson here at 60 Minutes headquarters in New York City.
It's my great pleasure.
Oh, and it's both of ours. Okay, so let's take off running. We're going to start with, what was your name at birth?
Robert Gardner Anderson, Jr., named obviously after my father.
Okay, and you're actually, that's how your credit reads, Robert G. Anderson.
Yeah, we dropped the junior because then there wouldn't have been room for any of the other letters. But it's just Robert G. Anderson, and my son is the third, so we're keeping the name going as long as we can.
And pretty much everyone calls you Bob?
Yes.
When and where were you born?
Chicago, Illinois, 1950.
What?
February 24th, many years ago.
Is that where you grew up?
Yes. I grew up in Chicago, but I wasn't doing very well at school, and I was sort of a pain. So after the 6th grade, my parents sent me away. Couldn't get me far enough away, sent me to school outside of Boston, where I went for the 7th and 8th grades, then Andover for 4 years, Phillips Academy, Andover, Massachusetts, and then Yale for 4 years, and then got a master's in journalism at Columbia here in New York.
Okay. Talk a little about your parents. What they did.
My father was a wonderful guy, long dead, but had a great sense of humor, had a bizarre hobby, which was recruiting football players for Yale, back when Yale sort of had a real football team. And I thought this was the strangest thing to do because there were 8 games a year. So he was building his life around essentially 8 hours a year. But in fact, it was terrific for him. He would go to high school games around Chicago on Friday nights, go to the Yale games on Saturday in the East, hang out with his friends for the weekend. It was a real social thing for him to hang out with his pals. And then I'm sure it helped get me into Yale because the person who told him that I'd been accepted before the envelope ever reached me was the Yale football coach.
I'm assuming he went there as well?
Yes.
Okay. What did he do for a living?
He sold insurance, and he hated it. When he graduated from Yale, it was the Depression, and he wanted to be a sports writer, but the only job that he could get was selling insurance. And he was the contact guy because back in those days, his friends went from Andover and Yale to run companies. So they would let him come in and give him the business, but he knew nothing about the business, so he would bring somebody with him that knew about the numbers. So he had all sorts of great accounts, but only because of the friends he'd made in school, not because he knew or cared at all about insurance. Which explains why he spent so much time on Yale football.
How about your mother? What was she like?
Mother started out working also. She became a private secretary to the chairman of a corporation, and she's very efficient, very everything in its place, very proper. And when her boss died, she got early retirement and has been living happily ever after on that ever since, and she's about to turn 98.
Oh, nice. Nice. What do you think you've inherited from your parents in terms of your traits?
Humor from my father, I hope, a sense of order from my mother, and they set a really good example of kindness and sensitivity to your fellow man, which I haven't inherited at all.
Do you have any siblings?
I have a younger sister, 6 years younger. She is immersed in the study of self. She's a very nice person. If you ask her how she is, she'll be telling you until time runs out, and she really means well. She didn't have children because she rightly realized that they would distract her from her major interest.
Okay, what kind of interest did you have growing up?
I was interested in sports, I think because Father was so sports-oriented. So we would go to games together of all sorts. And I was a lousy athlete. So rather than play, I became pretty good at coming up with excuses as to why I couldn't play, because I thought it was really embarrassing to strike out, even though I had a lot of practice at it. And even though I learned later that nobody cared less if I struck out, the other team rather liked it. But it was much better not to play to me. So I would be things like the official scorer or the groundskeeper or the umpire. But then it turned out I was also a lousy umpire. There'd be a close play at first, and I'd know that the ball had hit the mitt at a different moment than the foot had hit the bag, but it beat the hell out of me which had happened first. And I would look to the runner to see if he gave it away by his expression or the way he'd turn.
So really, what about news? Were you interested in news?
Yeah, but that came later. My first, when other people wanted to be firefighters and policemen, I wanted to be a baseball sportscaster. I wanted to follow a team, be their announcer, because I went to a lot of games, but I couldn't identify with the players. I knew I wasn't going to grow up to be the shortstop, so I thought I could announce the games. And then my mother, with this sense of order and propriety, explained that that really wasn't a high enough calling, that sports was too frivolous. And so I shifted over into news. And starting at Andover, I would sit alone in the basement of my dormitory where the TV was, in the dark, watching the evening news most every night. And that's when I decided I wanted to be Walter Cronkite.
So you were a CBS guy from the start?
Yeah, Walter Cronkite for some reason leapt out at me more than Huntley Brinkley.
Okay, and you mentioned that you went to Columbia for your master's in journalism, so you...
Yeah, and that was 1 year. They've now expanded it to 2, which if you're really into education, I'm sure isn't going to hurt you. But what struck me about journalism school was that you really should learn your journalism by doing it and not by studying it. And what was good about Columbia was they taught you good habits. On the other hand, I thought I'd probably have learned more if I'd had a job somewhere, but since I didn't have a job anywhere, it was good to be there.
Now, did you want to specifically do TV?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, TV looked like a lot more fun than being an ink-stained wretch. You could be one of those blow-dried people making lots of money, fame and fortune on TV.
Okay, so what did you do after you got your degree?
Well, I sent out letters to all sorts of stations from Honolulu to Philadelphia and papered my wall with their rejection letters because if you think about it, the logos at the top of TV stations' letterhead is really quite attractive. It comes in different colors and different numbers, and it made for good wallpaper. And I didn't take all the rejections seriously because they didn't know me. It was a matter of finding the one place that had an opening when I was knocking on their door, and that turned out to be Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So you may not have known this, but you are sitting across from the Waterloo correspondent of WMT in Cedar Rapids.
Talk about that. How did you get the job, first of all?
A family connection. I mean, after all that education and all those letters, what got me in the Cedar Rapids station was a family connection.
What was your first job there?
Reporter, on-air reporter. And it was a great opportunity to do exactly what I wanted to do and try to get better at it. And after a year or two, I sent a tape out to, as you do, the next bigger level of stations, to Milwaukee and even Chicago and Boston. And the tapes all came back with invariably the same response, which was, we rather like your stories. They're pretty well put together, but we don't like you at all. You look funny and you sound funny. Have you ever thought about producing? And a producer was born. It was terrific advice. I'd gotten being on TV out of my system and managed to have a lot more successful career producing than I ever would have had I tried to stay on the air.
Now, do you remember who told you this?
I remember that a news director in Boston told it to me face to face, and I got sort of a similar response by mail from a couple of other people. And it was really the right advice at the right time. And fortunately, the station that I worked for, their parent station was in Louisville. And so I was able to go from on air in Cedar Rapids, get a little producing experience there. I'd cover Waterloo by day and produce the 10 o'clock news at night when the 10 o'clock producer had moved on. And then I was able to go to the parent station in Louisville producing the 6 and 11 o'clock newses. So thanks to that station group, which was at that point called Orion, I was able to not just get my on-air experience, but start my off-air experience.
Okay, so you started in Louisville about, what, 1975 or so? What kind of stories were you covering at that point?
In Louisville?
Yeah.
I wasn't covering any. I was just
And you
sitting
producing
at the
what the stories
sitting
were.
at the desk deciding what the order of the stories would be. And that was back when local news still had a beat system, and we had somebody who covered the State House and somebody who covered the county and somebody who covered City Hall. And it was good enterprise reporting.
What was local news like at the time? Because it's very different now.
Well, I think part of it was this beat idea, that you really were assigned a part of your area to mine for stories. You didn't just rip it out of the newspaper that morning and then go put pictures on it. And so it was purer news, not nearly as many bells and whistles. It was a lot simpler graphically. We would use the same slide for auto accident behind the anchor man, no matter how many auto accidents we'd had that week or how many dogs or chickens were involved in the crash.
And where'd you go from there?
From there, I went to Philadelphia. Now, what happened was there was an impossible anchor person in Louisville. She was quite attractive and very good anchor, but absolutely impossible for people around her to deal with, especially producers. And she was vital to my career because she chased out my predecessor, thereby opening up the job. And when I signed on in Louisville, it was with the understanding that I would stay for a minimum of 2 years. They knew I wanted to move on, but if they were going to hire me, they wanted me to commit to 2 years, which I was happy to do. But after a year, I explained to them that I thought a year of working with her should count as 2, and they agreed, and so I was able to get out of there pretty quickly and move on to Philadelphia to produce the 5:30 to 6:30 evening news in Philadelphia.
It was a much bigger market, so what did you...
Infinitely bigger. That was great training, though, because we would have sometimes as many as 50 stories in the hour. Now, a lot of them were little 10-second briefs. We'd have national briefs, international briefs. And the trick was to try to have some connection, albeit sometimes far-fetched, from one story through 50 so that there was a flow. And by getting a flow in these stories, it's helped me ever after put a flow of disparate elements within one story. So it was very good training.
And how long were you there?
A year and a half.
Okay. Now, were you looking to move to a national venue?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to be Walter Cronkite. And in that case, by that time, I wanted to be Walter Cronkite's producer.
Okay, so you moved to CBS News in 1979, correct?
In Chicago, the Chicago Bureau.
Okay, talk about that.
Well, I went to the Chicago Bureau for an interview because they had a producer opening. And again, I mean, I think that in this business, the key is to get good. But invariably, I got a job because I knew somebody. And in this case, my news director in Philadelphia had gone on to be the news director at the CBS station in Chicago, and he knew that there was this opening at the CBS Bureau in Chicago and got me the interview. So I went for the interview, and while I was at lunch, an American Airlines DC-10 crashed while taking off from O'Hare. It was a horrible calamity. And the network stayed on doing specials on into the night, and I was immediately put to work. And that night, around midnight, the bureau chief drove me home and offered me the job.
So you were put to work during your interview.
Exactly.
What do you think the bureau chief saw in you that you got that job?
Well, he couldn't have seen much because he was looking in other directions at that on that day with all that was going on. But apparently, whatever I did was good enough to get him to say, well, he'd work for no pay. Maybe we should start paying him.
And talk about that job. What did you do?
That was the best. I mean, I would get up to take the 6 a.m. flight to Detroit because you'd leave at 6 and you'd land at 8 because you'd lose an hour, and we'd go there almost monthly when auto sales figures came out, and we'd blast a piece out for that night's evening news. And so to make the 6 o'clock flight, I'd be getting up around 4:30, and I remember walking through O'Hare just thinking this was the coolest job in the world. I was traveling for CBS News. It was really exciting because it's something I'd always wanted to do. So 6 a.m. was not early to me. I was happy to be on the flight. Mm-hmm. And in the course of the year and a half that I was there, I did stories from every state in the Midwest, including a sunflower story in North Dakota that had the lines, "Sunflowers are not just a pretty face," and of course, "business is blooming."
And who would you go with these? How would this, I mean, give us a sort of an in-depth look at what a producer would do on one of these shoots.
Well, on these shoots, it was really seat of the pants. You would get thrown into something, and you'd be on a deadline, usually for that night, so you had to move quickly. And one time, we got there was this big story, a palimony case, that some fellow who lived in Champaign-Urbana, downstate Illinois, had been living with a woman for 20-odd years, and the court had ruled that he didn't have to pay her anything as their relationship had broken up. And I think there'd been a big Lee Marvin palimony case or something that had made this a hot topic. So we blasted on a plane down to Champaign-Urbana, and we went to 1842 Main Street in Champaign, and I'm with Don Webster, who was the correspondent, and Don banged on the door, and fellow answered, and Don said, "Well, congratulations on not having to pay anything to that woman you lived with for more than 20 years. And he said, excuse me? Well, it turned out it was 1482 Main Street in Urbana, not Champaign, and he had some explaining to do to his wife, who wondered why we were there with a camera and who this other woman was, but we eventually made it to the right address and got on that evening. Okay. So that's what I mean by seat of the pants.
And what about the crews that you had?
We had one camera crew per story. I mean, I've gotten spoiled at 60 Minutes with 2, sometimes 3 crews. But obviously, covering the news, we had one crew. And there were several assigned to the bureau. And there was one fellow who was a sound man who had a lot of hair that was always unfurled and thick. And I remember riding in the car behind him one day, and the window was down, and he rubbed his hand through his hair, and something blew into my mouth. Don't know what it was.
Okay. What were some of the big stories that you were covering at that time?
The best was I got assigned to the John Anderson campaign. And that, of course, was a real live presidential campaign that went all the way to the November election. And he had his own plane, and we would take off early in the morning and stop in 4 states, and the schedule was always changing, and we would do evening news pieces and then stay up late and do a morning news piece and then jump on. And I would get 3 hours of sleep a night, and it was fine because the adrenaline was going, and when you got that little sleep, you could sleep anywhere. So as soon as I was in a seat on a plane or on a bus, I'd be catnapping. And it was just really exciting to be on this kind of travel schedule and to be covering the presidential campaign. I mean, we knew he wasn't going to win, but he was a real live contender. And it was a terrific opportunity for this neophyte news producer in the Chicago Bureau, because usually all the campaign assignments came out of Washington.
What did you learn about life on the campaign that you kind of took with you for your other producing?
I learned how good our correspondents were. I mean, we had some terrific correspondents on that campaign. Bob McNamara, Bob Faw, Eric Engberg. And they would rotate. And I just loved working with all of them because we were a team. they would let me ask questions in press conferences, and we kept trying to come up with angles, and we were determined not to follow the bouncing ball, not to just say, he stopped here, he said this, then he went there and said that. Because invariably this and that were the same thing because he had a stump speech. So we were always looking for angles, and one angle was, here's the electoral college map as they see it that would get them to 270 electoral votes, that if they were to win these specific states, they would win. We were the first people to break that former Governor Patrick Lucey was going to be John Anderson's running mate. We made a point of trying to stay ahead on the news, and it was really fulfilling to be able to do that.
Talk a little about the Chicago Bureau itself. How was it structured?
The Chicago Bureau had 5 correspondents back in 1980. There's been time more recently when there wasn't a Chicago Bureau at all. Now I think we have somebody assigned to the Midwest. But not only did we have 5 correspondents, but the Bureau would be on the evening news every night. We were always in the field, always chasing a story, and that's how I ended up in every state in the Midwest. So it was a very active, very productive Bureau. And if in 1980 you'd raised the idea that there would be no Chicago Bureau, let alone 5, 4, 3, 2, only 1 correspondent, would have been unthinkable.
Now, what kind of contact did you have with New York?
I didn't have much. The Jack Smith, the bureau chief, would talk to New York several times a day. The assistant bureau chief would talk to New York several times a day. And my contact would come when I was in the field and doing a story. I'd talk to what we call the fishbowl, where the show producers are, and talk to them about script, and what changes they wanted in the script, when we'd be feeding. That day of air conversation. But it was always day of air and specific story contact that would be the reason for a conversation. Otherwise, it was all handled at a level above me, and I'd just happily go where they told me to go.
How were the assignments divvied out? Did you have a specific type of story that you did best?
Well, what I got hired to do, no, and I still don't. I don't know that I do any best, but I'm a quantity guy. When I started out, my slot was weekend news producer, so I would do a feature each week in addition to whatever was breaking. And 2 features that were really memorable to me, one was about old people going to the racetrack for amusement. And it was great pictures, seeing these little old ladies at the racetrack using a magnifying glass to read the racing form. And this was great entertainment for them. They'd spend about $2 a race. They'd be around people of all ages. They'd have excitement. And so it had become a great spot for the elderly to hang out for an afternoon. And the other was also elderly oriented, I think just by coincidence, about taking animals to nursing homes, invariably dogs mostly, but some cats. And the story was about how when you put a puppy on the lap of a patient who had been silent for most days, they would come to life. I mean, it wouldn't get them out of a coma, but it would bring them much more into a much more lively state of mind.
Those are good stories.
Yeah.
So how long were you at the Chicago Bureau?
1.5 years.
What's the most important thing you learned during your tenure there?
The importance of making deadlines, meeting deadlines, the importance of writing, the importance of really just throwing it all out there and racing. I mean, my initial life, as we discussed, was one of avoidance of challenges. If there was an athletic event, I had to avoid it. This surprised me because this was very competitive with whoever else was covering the story. But it was great to be just all in. You had to have the best story you could possibly have by deadline.
Had growing up in Chicago helped you at the Bureau?
Well, it was comfortable being in Chicago. The Chicago part was really fun. I lived at home. But it didn't help me in terms of covering the stories. What helped me to do that was the experience that I'd gotten in Cedar Rapids, Louisville, and Philadelphia. And then covering stories was really different from producing TV newscasts. So covering one story would make me that much better at covering the next and the next and the next. So again, as I said, Columbia being fine, but learning in the field was better. This was a lot of learning in the field.
And you made a really big jump to Tokyo.
Yeah. We were covering a story. I think we'd covered a Super Bowl in Philadelphia. The Super Bowl wasn't in Philadelphia, but the Eagles were in the Super Bowl. And then we were flying on a charter to some place in Pennsylvania where some hostages, I don't know if this was the Iranian hostages, might have been, some people who were in a bad way. Their family, I remember now, a couple had been released, and they were in a hospital in Philadelphia. I don't know if this was the Iranian hostages, but people were in a hospital, not in Philadelphia, but somewhere else in Pennsylvania. And we were supposed to go and see if we could get through to them in the hospital, which was very off-putting because we were intruding on these people at a bad time, and it was just, ugh. And while we were in the plane, there was a phone call, and the phone call said, never mind, we're not going to do that story. And I got to yell into the cockpit, turn this baby around, we're heading for New York. And while in New York, they were looking for a bureau chief for Tokyo. And in this case, I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, got interviewed, and got the job.
Wow, that is a huge jump. I mean, how did you prepare for that?
Read a lot of books because it was all new to me. And it was really exciting I'd traveled a good bit. I'd actually been to Osaka, Japan, and Cambodia and Vietnam and Thailand when I graduated from Columbia, but only for a few days here and there. I didn't know anything about Asia except that I liked it. And to find myself in Tokyo was, again, exhilarating.
And how did you make your way through Tokyo when you first got there? The Japanese
well, we had a
culture
bureau.
And, yeah.
We had a bureau. CBS paid for me to take some Berlitz lessons before going over. And unfortunately, Japanese and English are diametrically opposed in every way, in that if you were to say 5 tables, 5 chairs, 5 light bulbs, the number 5 would be different each time, not just the noun. And it was terribly complicated. And you would, if it was a negative sentence, you'd put the no at the end, the way we say did and not. Well, that's normal in Japan. So I got pretty proficient at Japanese to the degree that I could talk to taxi drivers about going left, right, straight, or stop, and waiters to get food, and I knew how to order more beer. But there was no way I could be conversational in Japanese. But that and the fact that we had a bureau. And we had several people in the bureau who were terrific guides to get me grounded and pointed in the right direction.
Now, can you describe the bureau?
Yes. We were in the Tokyo Broadcasting System complex, TBS being the second biggest Japanese broadcasting bureau behind NHK, the national bureau, the national broadcaster. And we had a researcher, we had a camera crew, sound man, cameraman, we had an editor, we had a secretary who was invaluable. Everybody was invaluable. We were small, but we were very efficient, and we had all those bases covered. So if I needed to find out something, the researcher could do it. He could also line up stories. The sound man was Japanese, and the Japanese I learned from him really liked puns. So every day when we went out, he would pick up the light case, which was really heavy, and he'd barely be able to lift it, and he'd go, "Light case, ha ha ha." So that was the Japanese bureau, and it was an amazing experience to get to work there.
Talk about some of the major stories that you covered.
Well, we had one airplane that crashed into the bay. It was headed for Haneda Airport, which is the in-city airport, and it crashed in the water just short of the runway. And I couldn't get out there because they wanted reports constantly, but we had it on 5 different monitors in our office. So I was able to say, we see people on the wings, we can see that there are survivors. And it was a fascinating story because it being Japan, there were people on the plane that when it landed in the water, flicked on their recorders. And you would think, at least I thought, that the sound in the plane would have been pandemonium. But it wasn't. It was silent, except for a few people that were moaning and a few people that said they were cold. What had happened was, when the plane hit the water, the nose sheared off, water came pouring in, drowning several people in first class, but the rest of the plane, the passengers were absolutely fine. But the water was cold, and it was around their feet, and it was a cold day. And the flight attendants came on and said, just stay calm. We're very close to shore. Help is coming. Stay calm. And because the flight attendants took control, the passengers were very quiet and at least sounded calm, whether they felt it or not. Do you remember what caused that crash? The pilot flipped out and decided on the way in that he was just going to ditch the plane in the water. And the last words on the cockpit recorder were, "No, Captain, don't." And that's how they knew who had caused the crash.
Was it the Korean Air?
No, this was Japan
Oh,
Air.
it was Japan Air. What other stories did you cover at that time?
Well, being there for 3 years and covering all of Asia, I was outside of Japan literally 18 months. Half the time I was outside of Japan. And there were amazing stories there. One of them was the assassination of Benigno Aquino, who had gone back to the Philippines to run against Ferdinand Marcos and been greeted as he got off the plane by an assassin's bullet. And then his body traveled around the country building up political support, and it was a macabre route that he took post-mortem. And finally, months later, he was buried, and there was a huge procession. The parade to the burial site took many hours, and we were the only people who managed to rent a helicopter. And we had a camera crew up over this parade. Now, it was presumed by most people that Marcos and his people had assassinated Aquino because they didn't want him running against them. And in the end, that proved to be true. So the people on this parade with the body saw this helicopter overhead and assumed that it was a police helicopter, and they started shaking their fists at it. And the other networks all reported that they shook their fists at a police helicopter. We at least got it right that they were shaking their fists at our helicopter.
And where were you at that time? Were you
I was at the feed point waiting for tapes to come in and slapping a story together. And we'd been in the Philippines for close to 2 weeks waiting for this final burial. And the next morning, I was leaving Manila to go to Indonesia to look for spots that we would use as camera platforms. And I'd really been looking forward to this boondoggle in Indonesia. And at the Manila airport, I was paged to call CBS News in New York. And the person at the desk in New York said, "This is probably nothing, but a Korean airliner passenger plane is missing. So forget about Indonesia for the moment and go to Seoul just in case." And of course, that was the time the Russians downed Korean Flight 007. So I went from a couple of weeks in Manila to a couple of weeks in Seoul.
How was it trying to find out what really happened?
Well, you couldn't really investigate that because it had happened in the air. You could simply go to the obvious sources of potential information, and I fortunately knew the American ambassador, so at least I was able to get his thoughts, and he was pretty plugged in. So that was very helpful. Otherwise, it was just go to the obvious sources and find out as much as you can, but you couldn't find out anything investigating on your own because that was obviously impossible.
What was the biggest challenge for you working in Asia?
The biggest challenge was technical. It was hard to get a satellite. You had to book it well in advance. You had to book the feed point. And we got into understanding the journalism of it so we could go into most any country and know how to find the story. But getting the story was different from getting the story back to New York. There was one story. This was at the very start of the Civil War in Colombo, in Sri Lanka. And the majority, I don't remember what the majority was called, but the Tamil rebels were the minority. And the majority had burned out a bunch of Tamil shops and killed some people in the capital, Colombo. And we tried to fly right from Tokyo to Colombo, and the airport was closed, so we got as far as Hong Kong, and we had to stay there until the airport opened. And finally we got in, and we thought maybe they wouldn't let us take our camera gear in, so we divided up pieces and managed to smuggle enough pieces through to have enough gear, but our main equipment was impounded at the airport. And driving in from the airport, we passed a van that was burned out, and we stopped and took a look, and there was a body in it still smoldering, and we thought, whoa, this really is serious. And we got to the hotel, and they let us check in, but they said there is an absolute curfew against any street photography. You cannot go out with a camera, and there were Army troops everywhere. And so I remember sending a note to the foreign desk saying, well, it's the worst of all worlds. We're here, but we can't get there. We're confined to the hotel. And then one of our crew, I think it was the sound man, I know it wasn't me, said, well, why don't we interview the president? Hopefully I'd have thought of it eventually, but fortunately somebody thought of it well before I did. So we were able to interview the president. And while interviewing the president, we then got his permission to shoot some street scenes and got him to sign a piece of paper that I could show at customs, letting me take the tapes out. So I blasted out of there with the tape. The next flight out was to Singapore, and we edited the piece in Singapore, and we were the only evening newscast in America that actually had a piece coming out of Sri Lanka. It was little successes like that that were great fun at the time.
That's a great story. Were there other instances where you would have to smuggle in equipment like that?
Yes and no. Yes. In Nauru. We did a story in Nauru. Now, Nauru is a tiny country that's basically an island that had become wildly wealthy thanks to bat guano, which they had harvested for phosphates. And the phosphates collected on huge coral trees, it appeared. So they would dig out the phosphates, but then they were left with coral where ground had been. So they were running out of island as they ran out of phosphates. But man, were they making money. I mean, next to Kuwait, they had the highest per capita income. And they didn't want us to do a story because we'd asked and they said no. But we were flying, just happened to be in the neighborhood, and we were flying from New Caledonia to the Philippines, and Nauru was en route, so we got on Air Nauru, and we landed at midnight, and we got off with all our gear, and the people at customs figured, well, who would be in Nauru at 1 a.m. if they didn't have permission? So they let us in. But getting there was a bit challenging. We're on the plane. We're over ocean. There wasn't anything else below us but water. And the pilot, one of the pilots, came out of the cockpit with a thick book, a binder of some sort. And he sat down next to our cameraman and said, do you know anything about jet engines? It was not exactly a confidence builder. But fortunately, whatever the problem with our engine was, didn't prove to be insurmountable. And so there we were in Nauru, and we quickly shot what we could for a story, and then I left on the next plane to anywhere a day later. And the next plane to anywhere in this case was Sydney, which wasn't exactly the direction we were all going in, but at least it got the tapes out. And then Bob Simon, who was the correspondent, went to the government and said, well, here we are, we'd like to interview you. And they said, oh, you're the ones. No, we won't interview. The president isn't here, but get on the next plane to wherever you want to go, but you're getting out of here. So it was a good thing that I had absconded with the tapes earlier, or they would have been confiscated. And then the end of that was, once the president was contacted and told that we had the story, didn't he want to talk to us? He was in Hong Kong, and we were at that point in Manila, and we flew to Hong Kong and interviewed him and had it all.
Oh, that's a lot of work. Did you have a lot of contact with foreign governments? I mean, were they welcoming to CBS News, or was it a little harder sometimes?
Well, it was curious. It depended, of course, on the government. The Marcos situation. Marcos was very interested in currying favor with the United States. And so we would interview him with some regularity. And I remember several months after Aquino had been assassinated, we had just interviewed Marcos, and I was still at the palace, and the First Lady, Imelda, came in. Now, Imelda was a show person. She'd been a singer, and she was wearing an Hermes scarf. And I walked up and said, Madam First Lady, can you explain to me, I mean, it's just generally felt in America that even if you all weren't behind the assassination of Aquino, that you must have at least known it was going to happen. And she played with her scarf, made a big point of it, and she said, oh, well, you people in America, you overestimate us. You're a very sophisticated country, but we are not as capable of knowing all these things that you're capable of knowing. Well, the playing with the scarf was very effective because she was playing with her scarf. It made it impossible for me to get any sense of whether she was telling me the truth or not. If she just looked at me and given me an answer, maybe I would have had a sense. But because she did that scarf game, there was no way to get any clue from her answer. But that was pretty good access to have.
Any other stories like that about, really government officials either, giving you access or not?
Well, there was the president in Indira Gandhi. I was about to say the president in Sri Lanka, which we've discussed. We were in India for the Non-Aligned Nations Summit, which happened to be in New Delhi that year. And there had been some killings in the Indian state of Assam, where one tribe had wiped out a couple of dozen people from another. And Indira Gandhi held a press conference, and she seemed to allude to the fact that this was a press conference for the English-speaking press covering the Non-Aligned Summit, and she seemed to allude to the fact that somehow the CIA or something was responsible for what was going on in Assam, but it went by very quickly and nobody paid any attention to it. And then there was a little buffet, and as she was filling her plate, my correspondent, who was Gordon Josoloff at the time, and I went up to her and said, did you really mean to say that the CIA was behind the murders in Assam? And it was the kind of thing that she'd said before to try to distract attention from her government and just throw it off to the boogeyman, the CIA. And she leapt at that question and said, oh, yes, absolutely, definitely. The CIA, they're always meddling, and these deaths really bore the mark of the CIA. Well, that was great. It wasn't on camera, but we had both heard it. And so we had what we thought was a pretty good story, but Gordon Josoloff had worked for the Associated Press, and he knew that you didn't want to be too exclusive with a story like that. So he went over to a friend of his who was still with the Associated Press and said, here's what Indira Gandhi just told us, and you might want to check with her, but this is quite something. So we went back to the hotel and we led the evening news that night with Indira Gandhi blames CIA. And our competitors at ABC and NBC were rocketed out of their beds in the middle of the night, time change and all, with, where the hell were you guys? What about Indira Gandhi saying? And they said, well, no, we were there, and she barely mentioned the CIA at all. And then they said, well, it's all here on AP. So covering us with AP was very smart on Gordon's part. Again, you see a pattern here. Other people that I work with have terrific ideas that I'm able to ride to success.
How long were you with the Tokyo Bureau?
3 years. 3 great years. And again, in that time, much like the Chicago Bureau in Midwestern states, I got to every country in Asia, including eventually North Korea. And it was just fascinating assignments.
Well, what did you do in North Korea?
North Korea was holding, this was a year later and I came back to do it. North Korea was holding their counter to the Seoul Olympic Games. So they were letting a few journalists in to cover their version. And we had the chance to actually talk to some people on the street, which is usually not part of the dog and pony show. I mean, when you go in as a journalist now, they take you to the same memorials and statues and then whisk you on your way. But we were actually able to talk to some people. Now, the people in Pyongyang are true believers, and they have the better jobs, and they are considered the most loyal, and that's why they are allowed to be in Pyongyang. And other people need a pass to get into the capital. There's not free movement in North Korea. So they all wore, and I'm sure still do, pins that had either the great leader or the dear leader or both of them in their lapel. And so we said, do they make you wear that pin? And the question didn't translate at all, because you've got to understand that it's all great leader, dear leader all the time. We had the perfect shot of the baby in the crib in the hospital, pan up to the mother, pan up to the wall with the picture of the great leader and the dear leader. And the government television is the only television, and government radio is the only radio. And when we went to the subway station, there was a loudspeaker, and we thought it was announcing that the subway was coming. No, it was praising the great leader and the dear leader. So it's incessant. So when we said, do they make you wear this pin, they couldn't make any sense out of that. And when they finally got the point of the question, they invariably said, no, it's a great honor to wear this pin. And they meant it. And we said, well, what would happen if you lost the pin? Again, they couldn't begin to understand that question. And finally, when they got it, they said, well, how could you lose something so precious? So they really are on another planet there through no fault of their own, but that is a different slice of planet Earth.
So after your 3 years in Asia, you returned to the United States. Talk about that.
To the Washington Bureau, first of all, and covered the Republican and Democratic presidential conventions, and went on.
Was that 84?
Yeah.
What were those like to cover?
Well, again, it was new to me, so it was really exciting. And you'd go onto the floor, and there were all of these famous people, these senators and people you'd always seen, and there they all were grouped around. And, you know, the first presidential convention that I went to as a kid when I was at Yale, and it was in Chicago in '68. And a friend of my father's had a pass, and when he would get tired of going, he would give me the pass. This was back before the pass was person-specific. And I sat next to Red Smith, the great sports writer, in the press seats. And Red Smith, who I hadn't known until that night, was looking through the upcoming speeches. This was the first night of the Chicago Convention, and nobody was paying any attention to the speakers because they were all just having fun being on the floor, and the first night speakers weren't important. And so Red Smith was looking ahead in the speeches to see where people would applaud. And he said, actually, this is pretty easy, because they're going to applaud wherever there's a pause or wherever there's a famous name, because they're not listening to the speeches. And he said, whoa, look at this. This is the worst. They're going to go crazy here, and it is not when they should be applauding. And the line was, if we don't have gun laws, if we don't increase gun control, we will lose more great leaders like John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. Yay! Not exactly an applause line, but he knew it was coming.
So going back to 84.
Oh, yes, 84. We did a story in Dallas, which was where the Republican convention was, about how Dallas was the quintessential Republican city. And we had, it was an extremely wealthy city, country club city, and we had a fellow teeing off. We wanted to point out how many people played golf in Dallas. And we just sent a camera crew. And this guy, God love him, he looked at the camera and he said, they call this the mystery hour because nobody but God knows where this ball is going. And then he hit it. And that certainly made air. But it gave you a sense of Dallas where the building crane was the city bird. There was just construction everywhere. Remember, Bob Simon had a line, own the art, own the artist. Pavarotti performed there. Waiters at French restaurants spoke with a phony, affected French accent. It was just great stuff that Bob turned into a really good piece about the quintessential Republican city.
And then you became a producer for CBS Evening News.
Yes, that's what that was. When I was in the Washington Bureau and then moved to New York, it was to do evening news pieces. And I worked primarily with Bob Simon and Bernie Goldberg, and both were terrific writers and exciting to be around. And the greatest assignment that I had was when Bob Simon and I went off to Asia, back to Asia, for 10 weeks. And basically we were waiting to try to get our visas to go into Vietnam for the 10th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. This would have been 85. And Vietnam said, well, we're going to give you visas, but they were very iffy about when. So we started out in New Zealand, and we did a story about American ships with nuclear weapons being prohibited from docking in New Zealand. And then we went on to New Caledonia. We were killing time within range of Bangkok, where we'd pick up our visas. And we did a story on an uprising against French rule in New Caledonia. And then we went to Nauru. And then we went to the island of Leyte in the Philippines. And we were doing, at that point, I guess, 40-year anniversary pieces on the end of World War II. And Leyte was where General MacArthur, who had headed American forces based in the Philippines, and left at one point when the Japanese were getting too close, having uttered the famous words, "I shall return." Well, Leyte was where MacArthur returned. And there was a statue at the shore where he'd come in, and he'd walked, gotten off of a landing craft and walked through the water to the sand. And so now on that beach, there is a statue in water, to add to the realism, of MacArthur and the head Philippine general at the time, a fellow named Romulo, coming ashore. And for this 40th anniversary piece, we interviewed General Romulo. And we said, this had to be such an emotional time for you. Reclaiming your country for your people. As you're walking ashore, what is going through your mind? And he said, I was thinking about my butts. And we said, "Your boots?" And he said, "Yes. I had just bought new boots, and I was worried about what the salt water was doing to them," which wasn't exactly what we'd been looking for.
You said it all seriously? Yeah.
That's what he was thinking about, his boots.
So while you were waiting to get to get there, were you just making your stories? Were you able to just do whatever stories you wanted? Or
Yeah, we were just doing whatever we could find. We chose New Caledonia because there was a rebellion, and we took a helicopter to. I mean, it was sort of a friendly rebellion. I mean, it was going on and all, but I don't think there was a lot of firing. And we took a helicopter from the capital over the mountains to the rebel territory, where we interviewed the head rebel and got a T-shirt. And then coming back, there was heavy cloud cover. And there were, as we said, these mountains. And so the helicopter wasn't going to come through the clouds because he didn't want to hit the mountains, and he didn't have radar. And we were concerned about how long we could play this game until we were going to run out of gas, but obviously there was a break in the clouds before that happened.
Wow.
And then we went from there, as I said, to Leyte and Nauru, and then we were in Thailand, where we did a piece on the bridge on the River Kwai. And remember, after we finished that piece, we couldn't figure out how to end it. And then we realized that the ending was obviously the ending in the movie, where they blow the bridge up. So how can you do better than that? So that ended up being the ending of our piece. And then finally, the visas came through. We did 3 stories in Vietnam. And so in that trip, we'd been on the road for 10 weeks. We'd done 10 evening news stories from these various countries. And we won an Emmy for Bob's writing of those stories in Vietnam.
What was it like to film those stories?
It was really exciting to be in Vietnam, especially in Hanoi, because, this was only 10 years after the war, and very few people had been to Hanoi, Westerners, people from the States. We'd certainly been all over Saigon, but Hanoi was a new port of call for us. And it was very exciting to be there. I remember changing money. They had a crazy rate for the dollar, which was about 1/30th of the black market rate. But then again, we'd gone through all of these 10 weeks to get in there, and we didn't really want to get arrested and thrown out for changing money on the black market. So the government had assigned 2 young guides who seemed like pretty hip guys. And we gave them each a $100 bill at the start of our trip and said, if this goes well, there could be another one in it for you at the end. And we said, now, we'd like to change money, but we don't want to get arrested. Is it possible to do? And they said, yes, you go to this restaurant, give the owner of the restaurant your money, and you'll get back the better rate. So we went to the restaurant for lunch. We said, how much can you change? And he said, how much do you have? So we each changed $200. There were 4 of us. And then we waited, and we had lunch, and then we had dessert, and then we had coffee, and so far we were out $800. And then a girl came with a shopping bag with grapes on top of some newspapers. And she gave us the shopping bag and the grapes. And we took it back to our hotel, and the bag was absolutely full of money. It was all money. And we dumped it out on the bed, and we rolled around in it as though we'd robbed a bank, which we sort of had. And we needed nothing for the rest of our trip. Everything was virtually free, thanks to our changing that money and the guides telling us how to do it. I remember also running in Hanoi, listening to Bruce Springsteen singing Born in the USA, which includes the line, Born to Kill the Yellow Man, which our guide loved, and he used to listen to the Springsteen tape a lot. But that seemed a little odd to me.
Okay. Let's stop there and change the tape.